Every high-priced medical professional fled Agustin Costello's estate in tears before their first paycheck cleared. They expected a quiet patient. They found a monster. Brielle Edwards, carrying 280 pounds of unapologetic resilience and a battered nursing degree, wasn't looking for a monster. She just needed rent money. Darwin Myers rubbed his temples, listening to the echoing click of expensive heels retreating down the grand marble hallway. That was the fourth private nurse this week. Nurse Sarah had lasted 2 days. Nurse Abigail, a seasoned trauma specialist from Johns Hopkins, made it exactly 14 hours before Agustin threw a silver bedside tray at her head, screaming that her perfume smelled like funeral lilies. Agustin Costello was the undisputed head of the Costello crime family, a man whose mere whisper could freeze the blood of politicians and rival bosses alike. 2 weeks ago, a coordinated hit outside a steakhouse in Manhattan had left him with 3 gunshot wounds, one tearing through his shoulder, another shattering his ribs, and the worst nicking his liver. He had survived because Agustin Costello was too stubborn to die, but he was entirely bedridden in his heavily fortified upstate New York compound. Confined in pain and aggressively paranoid, Agustin had become a living nightmare for anyone attempting to care for him. Down in the foyer, the heavy mahogany doors slammed shut. Darwin Agustin's right-hand man and acting underboss stared at the clipboard of remaining candidates. There was only one left for the day. Brielle Edwards sat in the velvet waiting chair, looking entirely out of place amidst the gilded mirrors and Renaissance art. She was a large woman, undeniably fat, wearing a set of navy blue scrubs that stretched tight across her broad hips and thick thighs. Her sensible, thick-soled orthopedic shoes rested firmly on the Persian rug. She didn't possess the polished model-esque appearance of the high-end concierge nurses Darwin usually hired from elite Manhattan agencies. Brielle carried her 280 pounds with a quiet, grounded gravity. Her brown hair was pulled back into a severe bun, and her face, free of makeup, held an expression of profound exhaustion, mixed with steely determination. Darwin approached her, his tailored suit shifting around his broad shoulders. "Miss Edwards?" "Yes," Brielle replied, standing up. The movement was slow but steady. She met Darwin's sharp gaze without flinching. "I'll be frank," Darwin said, skipping the usual corporate pleasantries. "My employer is a very difficult man. He is recovering from severe trauma. He is not polite, he is not cooperative, and he is prone to volatile outbursts. We pay 5 times the standard rate because of this. The woman who just ran out crying is the 4th this week." Brielle adjusted the worn strap of her tote bag. "I've spent the last 6 years running the midnight psychiatric ward at Belmont Memorial in Brooklyn, Mr. Myers. I've been punched, kicked, spat on, and had my life threatened by people having severe schizophrenic breaks. If the check clears, I don't care how volatile your boss is." She needed this job, desperately, unfairly terminated from Belmont. After reporting a senior doctor's negligence, Brielle was drowning in debt. Her mother's medical bills were piling up, and the threat of eviction loomed over her tiny apartment. She didn't care if Agustin Costello was the devil himself. The devil's money spent the same at the grocery store. Darwin studied her for a long moment, noting the tired lines around her eyes and the absolute lack of fear in her posture. "Follow me." They walked up the sweeping staircase. Brielle took steady, rhythmic breaths, pacing herself on the steep incline. She was entirely aware of the physical space she occupied, entirely used to the subtle, judgmental glances her weight drew from men in expensive suits. Darwin, however, said nothing. He led her down a long corridor, flanked by silent armed guards, until they reached the master suite. He opened the heavy oak door. The room was cast in gloom. Heavy blackout curtains pulled tight against the afternoon sun. The air smelled of strong antiseptic copper and stale sweat. In the center of the room lay Agustin Costello. He looked terrible. His face, usually handsome, in a severe, sharp-angled way, was pale and drawn. Dark circles bruised the skin beneath his predatory green eyes, thick bandages wrapped around his torso, and IV lines snaked from his arms to monitors beside the bed. Despite being prone and broken, the aura of violence around him was suffocating. "I told you not to bring another idiot into this room. Dom!" Agustin rasped his voice, a gravelly rumble that vibrated in the quiet space. He didn't even look at Brielle. "Agustin, you need your dressings changed, and Dr. Evans said your antibiotics must be administered via IV every 4 hours. You cannot do this yourself," Darwin said smoothly, though a vein pulsed at his temple. Agustin finally rolled his head to look at the doorway. His green eyes dragged up and down Brielle's large frame. A cruel, mocking smirk twisted his pale lips. "This is a joke, right? The last one was a runway model who didn't know how to handle a syringe. Now you bring me a bakery delivery truck. What's she going to do? Sit on the infection?" Darwin stiffened, ready to intervene, but Brielle simply stepped forward, dropping her tote bag onto a nearby chair with a heavy thud. She didn't blush. She didn't cry. "My name is Brielle Edwards," she said, her voice clear and carrying no inflection of insult. "I am a registered nurse, and you, Mr. Costello, are currently exhibiting signs of a low-grade fever, likely due to the fact that you've been terrifying your medical staff into skipping your antibiotic rotations, so you can make all the fat jokes you want. I've heard better ones from high school dropouts in the ER. But right now, I need to check your vitals." Agustin's eyes narrowed dangerously. The smirk vanished. "Take one more step toward this bed, sweetheart, and I'll have my men throw you out the window." Brielle walked right up to the bedside, completely ignoring the threat. She reached for the blood pressure cuff. "It's a 2-story drop, Mr. Costello. I'm a heavy woman. I'd likely survive the fall, but your landscaping would be ruined. Roll up your sleeve." Silence stretched across the room. Darwin held his breath, his hand instinctively resting near the holster under his jacket. Nobody spoke to Agustin Costello like that. Not his capos, not his enemies, and certainly not the hired help. Agustin stared at Brielle, searching her face for the usual flutter of panic, the tremble of an eyelid, the scent of fear. He found nothing. Only the impassive, bored expression of a woman who had a job to do and was intensely tired of being delayed. Slowly, incredibly, Agustin extended his left arm. "Make it quick," he muttered, turning his face toward the wall. Darwin slowly backed out of the room, quietly closing the door behind him. For the first time in 2 weeks, a nurse had survived the first 5 minutes. The first week was a grueling test of endurance. Agustin treated his recovery like a war, and Brielle was enemy territory. He fought her on everything. He refused his food, he tried to rip out his IVs, and he hurled insults with the precision of a sniper. He was relentless in his attempts to break her probing for vulnerabilities. He specifically targeted her weight, assuming it was her weakest point. He demanded his water pitcher be refilled from the downstairs kitchen, rather than the ensuite tap, purely to force Brielle to walk up and down the massive marble staircase. He requested extra pillows, then threw them on the floor, demanding she pick them up. Brielle complied with every absurd demand. She climbed the stairs, sweat beading on her forehead, her chest heaving, but she never complained. She never gave him the satisfaction of seeing her cry. When he called her names, she responded with clinical indifference. "Are you sure you shouldn't eat my breakfast instead of giving it to me, Bee?" Agustin sneered one morning as she set down a tray of oatmeal and sliced fruit. "Looks like you could use the calories to fuel your next trip up the stairs." Brielle calmly adjusted the tray table. My caloric intake is none of your concern, Agustin. Your lack of protein intake, however, is severely delaying your tissue regeneration. Eat the oatmeal, or I'll have Darwin blend it, and I'll administer it through a feeding tube. Your choice? Agustin glared at her, then picked up the spoon. You're a miserable woman, Edwards. And you're a terrible patient, Costello. Chew. Despite the friction, a bizarre rhythm developed between them. Agustin began to realize that his usual tactics, intimidation, cruelty power, plays simply bounced off Brielle's thick armor. She was an immovable object meeting his unstoppable force. Furthermore, she was exceptional at her job. Her hands, though plump, were incredibly gentle and precise when changing his agonizing bandages. She knew exactly how to adjust his pillows to alleviate the pressure on his fractured ribs. She never woke him abruptly, and she kept the room at the exact cool temperature he secretly preferred. The turning point happened on the night of the 8th day. A severe thunderstorm was raging outside, rattling the heavy windows of the compound. The pressure systems were playing havoc with Agustin's shattered ribs. At 2:00 a.m., Brielle, who slept on a small cot in the adjoining dressing room, heard a strange, wet, coughing sound. She was up instantly, her bare feet padding quickly across the hardwood floor. In the dim glow of the medical monitors, she saw Agustin thrashing weakly on the bed. His face was grey, slick with cold sweat, and his eyes were wide with blind panic. He was gripping his chest, gasping for air. Agustin! Brielle snapped on the bedside lamp. He tried to speak, but only a gurgling sound emerged. The heart monitor began to shriek, the lines spiking erratically. Tachycardia. Brielle pulled back the heavy blankets and saw the dark, spreading stain of red soaking through the heavy gauze on his abdomen. The sudden coughing fit had caused a massive internal pressure spike, rupturing the internal stitches near his liver. He was hemorrhaging. "Darwin!" Brielle screamed at the top of her lungs, knowing the guards outside would hear. She didn't wait for them. She ripped open the sterile supply kit on the rolling cart. Blood was pooling rapidly, a terrifying, thick, crimson flow. If he lost too much blood before the private surgeon arrived, his weakened heart would go into arrest. 2 guards burst into the room, guns drawn, eyes wide with shock at the scene. "Don't just stand there. Call Dr. Evans now. Tell him, ruptured hepatic, sutures, massive hemorrhage. Get the O-negative blood bags from the basement fridge, now." Brielle barked her voice, carrying the absolute authority of a veteran trauma nurse. The guard scrambled to obey. Brielle grabbed a massive stack of sterile trauma pads. She pressed them directly over the bleeding wound. Agustin cried out, a raw sound of pure agony, his body arching off the mattress. "Hold him down!" Brielle yelled, as Darwin sprinted into the room. Darwin grabbed Agustin's shoulders, pinning him flat. The bleeding wasn't stopping. The arterial pressure was too high. Brielle's hands were slick with blood. Standard pressure wasn't going to be enough. She needed to compress the artery against the abdominal wall. Without hesitation, Brielle climbed onto the bed. She positioned herself over Agustin's torso, placed her hands directly over the pads, and leaned all of her 280 pounds forward, locking her elbows. She used her own heavy body weight as a human tourniquet. "Agustin, look at me." Brielle commanded, her face inches from his. His green eyes were glazed, rolling back in his head. "Look at me. Do not close your eyes. You don't get to die on my shift. It ruins my resume." Agustin focused on her face, his breathing shallow and ragged. The sheer, crushing weight of her pressing down on his wound was agonizing, but it was working. The monitor's frantic beeping began to slow, stabilizing just slightly as the rapid blood loss was forcibly stemmed. "You're crushing me." He managed to choke out a faint, bloody smile touching his lips. "Good. It means you can still feel." Stay awake, Agustin. Brielle ordered, sweat pouring down her face. Her arms were shaking from the effort of maintaining the locked pressure, but she didn't shift a single inch. They stayed in that brutal, intimate deadlock for 25 minutes. Brielle didn't waver. She spoke to him continuously, her voice shedding its usual dry sarcasm, replaced by a low, steady, and strangely soothing cadence. She told him about the stray cats she fed in Brooklyn, the noise of the subway, anything to keep his brain anchored to the waking world. By the time Dr. Evans and his emergency surgical team burst through the doors rolling a portable cauterization machine, Brielle was pale and exhausted, her scrub top soaked in Agustin's blood. "I've got it," Nurse Dr. Evans said, quickly stepping in. Brielle slowly released the pressure, her arms trembling violently. She climbed off the bed, stumbling slightly as her numb legs hit the floor. Darwin caught her arm, steadying her. He looked at the blood covering her, then at the stabilized readouts on the monitor. "You saved his life," Darwin said quietly, over the chaotic noise of the medical team going to work. Brielle just nodded, sinking heavily into the velvet armchair in the corner. She watched as they worked on the ruthless Mafia Boss. For the first time, she didn't see a monster. She just saw a broken man. And as the anesthesia finally pulled Agustin under his green eyes, stayed locked on the large, exhausted woman in the corner until the very last second, he realized with absolute clarity that Brielle Edwards was the strongest person in the room. Agustin awoke to the rhythmic, mechanical hum of the heart monitor. His eyelids felt like they were lined with sandpaper. As his vision cleared, the first thing he saw was Brielle. She was asleep in the velvet armchair, her head tilted awkwardly against the high back, soft snores escaping her lips. For the first time in his violently orchestrated life, Agustin Costello felt a strange, jarring sensation behind his ribs that had nothing to do with surgical staples. It was gratitude. Messy, complicated, and entirely unfamiliar gratitude. He remembered the crushing, suffocating weight of her, pressing down on his open wound. He remembered the fierce, unwavering command in her voice when she told him he wasn't allowed to die. Every other person in his life, his capos, his mistresses, his rivals, wanted something from him or feared him. Brielle Edwards simply wanted him to survive his own stubbornness. When Brielle finally stirred, adjusting her glasses and rubbing the crick in her neck, she found Agustin watching her. His green eyes were sharp, devoid of the feverish haze that had clouded them for weeks. "Morning," Brielle said, her voice raspy. She stood up, smoothing down her wrinkled scrubs. "I need to check your temperature. Do not throw the thermometer this time." Agustin didn't smirk. He didn't insult her. He simply opened his mouth. Over the next 2 weeks, the dynamic in the master suite completely inverted. Agustin became a model patient, but only for Brielle. If Dr. Evans or Darwin entered the room, the ruthless mob boss returned, snapping orders and demanding answers about his business. But when Brielle walked in, carrying his medication or his meals, the room's temperature seemed to drop. Agustin watched her constantly. He noticed how her thick-soled shoes squeaked slightly on the hardwood, how she pinned her brown hair back with cheap plastic clips, and how she never once looked intimidated by the men carrying concealed weapons outside his door. The twist in his recovery arrived on a rainy Tuesday. Darwin had contracted a new physical therapist from a highly recommended sports medicine clinic in Manhattan to help Agustin regain mobility in his shoulder. The man introduced himself as Gregory, a tall, lean professional with a soothing voice and a polite smile. Brielle was organizing the medical cart in the corner, while Gregory began assessing Agustin's range of motion. Agustin was gritting his teeth through the pain, distracted, but Brielle wasn't. Her years in the chaotic Belmont psychiatric ward had honed her instincts into a razor-sharp radar for anomalies. She watched Gregory. His hands were shaking slightly, His focus wasn't on Agustine's shoulder joint. His eyes kept darting toward the IV line feeding directly into Agustine's arm. "Mr. Costello needs to rest between extensions," Brielle stated, stepping forward. "Just one more rotation." "Nurse," Gregory replied smoothly, reaching into his pocket. He pulled out a small, pre-filled syringe. "I'm just going to administer a mild muscle relaxant to ease the friction." Brielle's eyes locked onto the vial. The fluid inside was slightly cloudy, unlike the crystal-clear Toradol Dr. Evans prescribed. Furthermore, physical therapists did not administer IV push medications. Ever. "Stop!" Brielle commanded, her voice dropping an octave. Gregory ignored her, his thumb moving to the plunger as he lunged toward Agustine's IV port. Brielle didn't hesitate. She didn't call for the guards. She dropped her clipboard and threw her entire body weight forward. 280 pounds of momentum collided solidly with Gregory's ribs. The impact sounded like a car crash. Gregory was thrown completely off his feet, crashing backward into the heavy oak dresser. The syringe flew from his hand, shattering against the stone fireplace. Before the assassin could recover, Brielle was on top of him. She drove her knee hard into his chest, pinning him to the floor. Gregory thrashed, swinging a wild punch that caught Brielle on the cheekbone, snapping her head back. She tasted copper. "Darwin!" she roared, grabbing Gregory's wrists and slamming them down against the hardwood, using her substantial weight to entirely immobilize him. "Get in here!" The doors blew open. Darwin and 3 guards swarmed the room, weapons drawn. They dragged a cursing, spitting Gregory off the floor. Agustine was sitting up in bed, ignoring his screaming abdominal stitches. He stared at the shattered syringe by the fireplace, then at Brielle. She was breathing heavily, a dark purple bruise already forming on her left cheek, her hair escaping its severe bun. Darwin sniffed the puddle of liquid by the fireplace. Fentanyl. Massive dose. He would have been dead in 60 seconds. He looked at the assassin. "Take him to the basement." As the guards dragged the man away, Darwin turned to Brielle, running a hand over his face. "Miss Edwards, I need an ice pack," Brielle said, flatly, wiping a drop of blood from her lip. She turned to Agustin. "And your blood pressure is undoubtedly spiking. Lie back down." Agustin didn't move. He stared at her, his chest heaving. The realization hit him with the force of a freight train. She hadn't just saved him from his own body, she had actively thrown herself into the line of fire. She was fearless. She was magnificent. "You're bleeding," Agustin whispered, his voice thick with a terrifyingly dark, possessive emotion. "It's a busted lip, Agustin. I've had worse from a 90-year-old dementia patient," Brielle replied, turning away to fetch the ice. Agustin watched her walk across the room. In his brutal world, loyalty was bought, extorted, or beaten into people. It was fragile. But this woman, this heavy, exhausted working-class nurse, was made of iron, and Agustin decided in that exact moment that he was never letting her go. 6 weeks later, Brielle's contract officially expired. Agustin was out of bed, walking with a cane, his terrifying presence fully restored. The compound was buzzing with the renewed energy of the Costello family business. But inside the master suite, a cold war was brewing. Brielle was packing her worn canvas tote bag. "I double-checked your medication schedule with the new daytime nurse," Brielle said, not looking at him. "She's fully briefed on your physical therapy limitations." Agustin stood by the window wearing a tailored charcoal suit that hid the bulk of his bandages. His knuckles were white as he gripped the head of his cane. "You aren't leaving." "My contract is fulfilled, Agustin. You are stable. You don't need a 24-hour trauma nurse anymore." Brielle zipped the bag closed. "I'll triple your salary, $250,000 a year, just to stay on the estate." Agustin countered his voice, a low, dangerous rumble. Brielle finally looked at him. She saw the panic hiding beneath his ruthless exterior, but she shook her head. "I am not a pet, Agustin. I am a medical professional. I have a mother in a care facility in Brooklyn who needs me to visit her. I have my own life. I live in reality, not in a fortified castle." "Reality is overrated," he snapped. "Reality is where I belong," she replied softly. She picked up her bag, walked over to him, and did something that made Darwin, who was watching from the doorway, hold his breath. She gently placed her hand over Agustin's tightly clenched fist on the cane. "Take your antibiotics and stop threatening your staff." With that, Brielle walked out. Returning to Brooklyn was like plunging into an ice bath. Her tiny apartment was exactly as she left it, cramped, smelling faintly of old radiators, and littered with past-due bills. Despite the massive checks she had received from the Costello estate, much of it immediately went to paying off her mother's exorbitant nursing home debts. She tried to slip back into her old routine, applying for shifts at local clinics, but every time she looked at a patient, she saw sharp green eyes and a terrifying smirk. She missed the verbal sparring. She missed the strange electric tension of the compound. On a suffocatingly humid Thursday afternoon, 2 weeks after she left, Brielle was walking back from the grocery store, carrying heavy plastic bags that dug into her palms. As she turned onto her narrow, trash-lined street, she stopped dead in her tracks. Parked illegally in front of her crumbling brick apartment building were 3 massive armored black SUVs. Standing on the sidewalk looking entirely out of place amidst the peeling paint and broken concrete was Agustin Costello. He was leaning on his cane, flanked by Darwin and 2 heavily armed guards. Neighbors were peeking out from behind drawn blinds, terrified by the sudden mafia presence on their stoops. Brielle sighed, walked up to him, and set her groceries down on the sidewalk. "Agustin, you are blocking the fire hydrant. You're going to get a ticket." Agustin looked at the dilapidated building, then back at her. "You left? We discussed this." "You dictated terms and walked out," Agustin corrected, taking a step closer. The sheer height and presence of the man made the bustling street feel incredibly small. "I've spent the last 14 days sitting in a mansion, surrounded by people who agree with everything I say. It's miserable. I fired the new nurse. She cried when I told her the soup was cold." Brielle crossed her arms over her chest. "I am not coming back to work for you." "I know," Agustin said smoothly. He reached into his jacket pocket. Darwin instantly handed him a thick manila folder. Agustin held it out to Brielle. "So I bought Belmont Memorial Hospital." Brielle stared at him, her mouth falling open. "You what?" "I bought the hospital," Agustin repeated casually, as if he were discussing buying a cup of coffee. "I found the senior doctor who fired you for reporting his negligence. I had Darwin explain the concept of severe consequences to him. He no longer practices medicine. He is currently relocating to a very remote part of Alaska." Agustin, you can't just buy a hospital to prove a point." Brielle gasped, horrified, and secretly fiercely thrilled. "I can, and I did. I transferred your mother to the VIP wing. She has round-the-clock premium care." Agustin continued stepping so close that Brielle could smell his expensive cologne. "You said you lived in reality, Brielle, so I am rewriting your reality." "Why?" she demanded, her heart hammering against her ribs. Agustin reached out his large, scarred hand, gently tracing the line of her jaw, his thumb brushing over the spot where the assassin had bruised her cheek weeks ago. The ruthless mob boss looked at the heavy, exhausted nurse with a reverence that defied explanation. "Because you are the only person in this god-forsaken world who looks at me and isn't afraid. Agustin whispered, his voice thick with raw honesty. Because you pinned a hitman to the floor and took a punch to protect a man who did nothing but insult you. Because I am a monster, Brielle, but I am entirely, irrevocably yours. Come home. Not as my nurse, as my equal. Brielle looked into his eyes, searching for a lie, a manipulation, a trap. She found only absolute, terrifying devotion. She looked at the armored cars, the bewildered neighbors, and then at the man who had torn down her obstacles with a wave of his hand. Slowly, a genuine smile broke across her face. "If I come back," Brielle said, picking up her grocery bags, "you are eating your oatmeal every morning without complaining." Agustin's lips curled into a predatory, victorious smirk. He signaled Darwin to take the bags from her. "Yes, ma'am." As they climbed into the back of the SUV, leaving the sweltering streets of Brooklyn behind, Brielle knew her life of quiet desperation was over. She had walked into a lion's den to pay her rent, and somehow she had walked out as the queen of the jungle. Did Brielle and Agustin's intense, rule-breaking romance leave you completely breathless? This story proves that true strength isn't about fitting a specific mold. It's about unapologetic resilience and holding your ground even against a ruthless mafia boss. If you loved this dramatic twist on the mafia romance genre, smash that. Like button, share this video with your fellow romance addicts, and subscribe to our channel for more thrilling, real-life inspired audio dramas every single week.